Hello, and welcome to our panel, Digital Platforms in Public History, Insights from our Ask Historians. My name is Mills Kelly, and I'm a professor of history at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, and a visiting professor at Johannes Gutenberg University in Mainz, Germany. Before we begin the panel, I'm going to turn to Lisa Baer-Tsarfati for our acknowledgement.
Thank you, Mills. We acknowledge that our panel is being produced in and viewed from various locations across the world. Many of these locations include lands that are the ancestral, unceded, and treaty territories of Indigenous peoples from Turtle Island, Abya Yala, and the Americas in their entirety, to the traditional lands of Indigenous peoples in Sweden, Australia, Africa, Asia, and across the globe. We acknowledge that these lands have been stewarded by these Indigenous communities and the nations since time immemorial, and we offer our gratitude to these peoples. We, moreover, recognize that 500 years later, settler colonial nations continue to benefit from the brutal realities of genocide and forced removal that enabled the original settler colonizers and conquistadores to seize these lands. We acknowledge both the land upon which we are virtually presenting this panel, those lands from which this panel is being viewed, and the deep-rooted and long-lasting wounds caused by white imperialism and settler colonialism. The harmful effects of these actions continue to hurt Indigenous communities across the world. We recognize the responsibility we have as historians to amplify Indigenous voices and speak for those who can no longer speak for themselves. We also acknowledge that while we pursue this goal, academia itself has often been at the forefront of colonial domination and must therefore reckon with its own injustices. Understanding this, we have chosen to make a donation to the Indigenous organization Forest Peoples Program in an effort to give back to Indigenous communities around the world. While we appreciate that Indigenous political, trade, and kinship relations extend beyond the geographic boundaries that we commonly assign to distinct communities and nations, we would like to particularly acknowledge the Indigenous peoples upon whose ancestral lands our panel has been produced or hosted as follows: the Gayokono, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Neutral Peoples, the Dogue, and the Rappahannock. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Our first panelist is Sarah Gilbert, who is a research associate at Cornell University in the Department of Communication, where she's been for the past 2 years. So, Sarah, the floor is yours.
I'm really excited to be kicking off our panel today with my paper, Towards Intersectional Moderation, Accounting for Power with Care, where I'll be drawing from over 7 years of research with the AskHistorians community. I'm a white, female presenting person with long brown hair and gold rimmed glasses. I'm wearing a black t-shirt and blazer. Online epistemic communities, or places where people go to learn and share expertise, are important sources of information for billions of people worldwide. Epistemic communities can take a lot of different shapes online. Sometimes entire platforms provide opportunities to share information, like Wikipedia, for better or for worse. And sometimes there's individual communities on wider platforms, like AskHistorians, which I'll be talking a lot about today. Epistemic communities might also form as broader networks or around individuals like influencers. As freely available sources of knowledge, epistemic communities play an extremely important role in the information ecosystem because they're more accessible than traditional sources of information to people who may be limited by time or money or place. And they're also open for people who have expertise but may not be regarded as an expert so that they can share their knowledge as well. Behind the scenes, these communities are shaped by moderation, often done by volunteers who develop standards, enforce rules, and model norms. And this moderation really matters. Well, moderation is good. It means that people can access trustworthy information and know that they can share it. But good moderation is easier said than done. Turns out that there's a balance to strike. So people get hurt when there's not enough moderation. Turns out that when you let people say whatever they want, they will, and that light doesn't actually provide a disinfectant for hate or disinformation or abuse. But then on the flip side, too much moderation also ends up hurting people who are often the least powerful in society. They're subjected to bans and removals at the highest rates, which reinforces existing power structures in society. So if we want to understand how we ended up in this kind of really sucky, tricky moderation space, it helps to look back to the foundations of the internet, which were grounded in a very particular and very American idealization of freedom of speech. In particular, the original goals and values of early online platforms, developers, and users tended to be the creation of spaces that provide freedom of individuals to speak, which means that any restriction on speech becomes a form of censorship. But freedom to do something isn't the only kind of freedom. We also need to be free from oppression. And so what ended up happening is that the folks in the majority tended to be the ones speaking freely, often at the expense of people with less power, who were crowded out, bullied out, or felt like they needed to sit out. In other words, centering some people's freedom to speak resulted in others not being free from oppressive speech. And so really when we think about it, it's all about power. So who's empowered to speak on the internet and who is disempowered as a result? And if we want to understand more about power, the best place to look is Black feminist theory, and in particular, intersectional feminism. Intersectional feminism describes how aspects of individuals' identities create unique combinations of discrimination. Patricia Hill Collins added another layer to this. So in addition to intersections of identity affecting oppression and resistance, so do different layers of power. So there's power upheld within people's personal relationships, within communities and groups, and power that's upheld by social institutions. And so any kind of approach to moderation that doesn't account for these intersections, particularly at this matrix of domination, generates a higher risk of replicating oppression and suppressing resistance. So to show you what I mean, I'm going to be using two examples from my research with AskHistorians to show how power can be reinforced and also countered through moderation. First at the policy level, and then through decision-making and proactive moderation. But first, a little bit about the community. So AskHistorians is a question and answer style community dedicated to making sure people get trustworthy answers to their questions about history. It's over 12 years old now and has just over 2 million subscribers. We haven't done a census in a while, but pretty consistently past surveys have shown that most subscribers tend to be young, white, male, and American. And one of the things that makes AskHistorians unique is that it has a mission, and that's public history. So to that end, the community has, over the course of the last 12 years, developed a really extensive set of rules to ensure that it can meet these goals. So more on those soon. But first, because our panel is about doing history on Reddit, I want to take a moment to introduce the platform on which AskHistorians is hosted. So unlike other social media platforms where you follow people or friend people, Reddit is organized around interest-based communities, which are called subreddits. Subreddits are created and run by users called community content moderators, and content like photos or videos or text is submitted to subreddits by any user with an account, which is typically pseudonymous. Users submit content, but ultimately this content is controlled by 3 different layers of moderation: the community standards, which are written and enforced by the platform itself, community moderators who can remove and ban content and remove content and ban users from their individual subreddits. And then there's also users themselves through voting. And so this voting system is really Reddit's bread and butter. If you have an account, you can upvote content and comments that you like and downvote things that you don't like. And so what ends up happening is that content that a lot of people upvote will rise to the top of various feeds, while content that people downvote will be obfuscated from view. And so because people are very much in control of what gets submitted and what gets seen on Reddit, it's important to know a little bit about who these people are. So participation in Reddit is synonymous, so it's kind of hard to understand exactly who's participating, and there aren't really very many detailed statistics out there. But generally, participants tend to be fairly young, more than half are male, they're highly educated, they're predominantly white, and they're mostly American. So what ends up happening is that through the upvoting system, the interests and values of this demographic often end up being promoted. And another important thing to know about Reddit is that historically, the site has highly valued free speech. So the idea is that users through voting should be the ones to decide what's seen and what's hidden, rather than moderators through removals. So as I mentioned, AskHistorians is pretty heavily moderated. And because of this, there's sometimes a clash between what users expect and want, and how the community operates as an epistemic space. So I said I was going to tell 2 stories about moderation. The first is about policymaking. I mentioned earlier that Ask Historians has this extensive set of rules that help it realize its public history mission. However, as I'll describe next, sometimes policies that help the communities meet its goals actually end up undermining its ability to meet others. So in this section, I'm going to be talking about some upcoming work that I've done in collaboration with Kyle Pittman, a professor of Native American Studies, Nampu descendant, Ask Historians mod, and a very dear friend of mine. So up on the slide here, I've got a very short version of Ask Historians rules, which you can also view by going to the website itself. Each of these is accompanied by a post explaining the rationale for the rule and how it contributes to the community's public history mission. I'm going to highlight a couple that are particularly relevant for this story so that you don't have to try to digest all of them. Or go and search for all of them so that you can read them yourselves. But the first rule, for example, is designed to make sure that the community is a safe place to ask questions and that the answers are free from hate-based disinformation. So by prohibiting things like racism and bigotry or offensive behavior. Numbers 5 and 6, which are for providing primary and secondary sources of and asked and prohibiting anecdotes, are really designed to make sure that the information that people share can be verified. And so this allows moderators to make judgments based on content rather than credentialism, which makes the community more inclusive of people who have expertise rather than requiring a fancy degree in order to participate. These rules are pretty strict, as I've mentioned, and are actively enforced, as I've mentioned. But this ends up meaning that the answers that most people provide end up being removed under these rules. And so while it's really easy to think of this kind of removal as a form of censorship, there's a rationale behind it. And I think this quote from a former moderator, Commustar, does a really nice job of explaining why when he says, a major part of that effort has been to delete comments that are low effort or speculative or promote pseudo-history or bigotry. The Ask Historians mod team sees the deletion of such bad comments as curating the sub, akin to pulling out weeds so flowers can grow. So in other words, removing content when it violates policies actually creates space that allows people to contribute in ways that advance this public history mission. And most of the time, the rules are successful in building trust and inclusivity in the community. However, there are a few cases where this doesn't apply. For example, for verification, what do you do when there are no sources, or when sources about a group of people are inaccurate, or when the information in sources was stolen, and when methods for recording and passing on your knowledge are often deemed invalid? So this is the case with Indigenous histories and for Indigenous ways of knowing. So if someone wants to use Indigenous methods to answer a question, they may end up violating Ask Historians policy and being removed by non-Indigenous moderators. I can actually recall an incident where this very thing happened. An answer was removed by somebody who, because they cited their grandmother, who was also an elder, as a source for violating the rule on anecdotes. And so when this happens, the public history mission of the community is actually undermined. So instead of creating space for an Indigenous person to share their history, space is created for an answer that reflects white Western approaches to knowledge. And then this harm is compounded by Reddit's socio-technical system. People will upvote the answer that exists, which ends up propagating and reinforcing white Western ways of knowing at the expense of Indigenous knowledge and people and experts. So what do you do when the policy is wrong? Fix policy, of course. Back in 2019, there was an attempt to do just this. However, there were a few issues with this effort. So while two moderators took the lead, one of whom was Indigenous, the draft was primarily authored by a more senior member of the team who was not. As a result, there was more emphasis on oral history, which was what she was familiar with, rather than Indigenous methods. It also reflected some pretty serious biases. So for example, it prevented sources from close family, despite these being important and trusted sources among many Indigenous groups. It also required the question answerer to be well-versed in scholarship surrounding the subject. And so this would have neglected the history of abuse of Indigenous knowledge and would have demanded that Indigenous people conform to Western research norms in order to be considered legitimate. Basically, it would have rendered answerers to use external sources to legitimize their own information. So this draft was fortunately never implemented, since it likely would have caused more harm, but unfortunately the effort has not been taken up since. And so there's a few reasons for this. First is that policy building takes time. It can't be haphazard because, as we saw, bad policy might be worse than no policy at all. It also takes expertise. So in order to build a policy that works, it needs people who are experts in Indigenous history and methods and who understand the goals and challenges faced by the community so that the mission is preserved. So what ends up happening is that the more straightforward method of reparation itself generates a form of racialized labor in which certain members of the moderation team may become responsible for contributing a disproportionate amount of time and energy to crafting policies or launching initiatives. So I'm going to leave you on that rather pessimistic note and switch gears because policymaking isn't the only area that impacts who's free to speak. So does everyday decision making and also thinking creatively about how problems can be addressed before they arise. So unfortunately on Ask Historians, when we get questions about colonialism, they tend to look something like these. For example, what caused the Americas to be so much more primitive when they were discovered? They're talking about Africa as undeveloped or underdeveloped in comparison and so far behind in development. And so these all reflect strongly held assumptions and value judgments about colonized peoples and colonialism, that it brought development, which is something that we're taught is good. And so these are really challenging to deal with because on the one hand, these assumptions are really hurtful and really harmful. But on the other, the mission is public history and the answers that people get can help correct these assumptions. So another opportunity to correct these assumptions arose in 2020 when the Trump White House issued a proclamation on Columbus Day accusing radical activists of undermining Columbus's legacy by highlighting his atrocities. Just a few months earlier, the Ask Historians moderation team had provided a history of racist policing in the United States, which I've written about. And so this time they decided it would be an Indigenous Peoples Day post to throw shade at this proclamation. So at the time, Ask Historians had two Indigenous moderators, Kyle, who I introduced you to earlier, and Morgan Lewin Campos, who is a descendant of the Anonine Kenk and Gunaca Kone peoples located in Argentina. Together, they took a lead on drafting a post, making sure that it would not be entirely US-centric. They posted their draft to the subreddit early in the morning or early-ish in the morning and joked that they were ready for a fight. Unlike the post on the history of racist policing, which rose to the front page of Reddit really quickly, this one got a pretty slow start upvote-wise. But while the upvotes might have been slow, the pushback was really quick to come. Here are a few examples of some of these early comments that the post got, which I know you probably can't read them, but it's lots of people continuing to admire Columbus, such as the first comment on the slide, which refers to him as a giant of human history, and also a lot of people reflecting those same assumptions that we see in the question asking, that colonialism was ultimately a good thing because it brought with it things like democracy, human rights, innovation. Assuming these things didn't happen in the Americas before, and I know everybody knows this, but they did. In addition to pushback on the anti-colonialist message of the post, people also pushed back on Morgan's introduction with "Hola a todos, todes y todes." Morgan, who is non-binary and speaks Spanish as their first language, wanted the post to be inclusive and so used the gender-neutral todes. Kyle and Morgan were the two most active participants in the thread, fielding questions and responding to this pushback. Behind the scenes, other moderators supported them by removing comments, banning users, and engaging in supportive banter on Slack. Both Kyle and Morgan contributed detailed responses to people, often who didn't like what they were reading. So you can see an example of somebody here using the reporting system to engage in tone policing. So this is being reported for incivility or rudeness, or what I can promise you is a very polite under the circumstances comment. As they began to speak directly about the impacts of colonialism, and in particular the kinds of reparations that would be effective, Kyle and Morgan's comments began to collect downvotes, which you can see an example of here, which ended up collapsing them from view while colonialist statements remained visible, which you can see in effect with the top comment receiving 76 upvotes, and one receiving so many downvotes it's actually collapsed and invisible. So while the moderators supporting in the background were able to come and go throughout the day, Kyle and Morgan were constant. After 10 hours, Kyle finally expressed frustration. He was done being nice and fuck everyone. Even when he was putting in a lot of work to regulate his tone, he was getting this kind of pushback anyway, which he described as a form of institutionalized racism. Later on, reflecting on the incident, Morgan would tell me, I had only been a moderator for a few months at the time, so I was still somewhat reluctant to express certain emotions. However, I recall talking privately with Kyle about how deeply frustrated I was feeling. It was getting late, and it had been a long day of receiving nonstop pushback and even aggression. One particular comment that comes in mind was someone outright and doubting my ingenuity and identity because one of the terms I'd used to refer to my ancestral tribes, even though I clarified why I was using said term. I don't remember exactly what the comment said, but the core of it was a true member of this tribe would never use this term. You're obviously lying. It was jarring seeing people ignoring what I said, nitpicking my words without any contextualization, and refusing to engage with my responses in good faith. It was exhausting. So the next morning, Kyle and Morgan woke up to even more racism and more transphobic comments. After some initial joking with the team, they actually began to discuss the impact of the thread with the wider moderation team. And how sometimes outright bigotry can be easier to handle as moderators because it's actually actionable. Whereas the pushback that Kyle and Morgan had received in a lot of cases was a lot harder because it was oppressive without actually technically violating any of the rules. However, there were a lot of bright spots with this post. It was incredibly informative to some people, like this person on the slide here who said, I would just really like to say that I appreciated the effort and education in the Indigenous Peoples Day thread. I know there were a lot of downvotes, so I just wanted to give a shout out to the work of Equatorman and Snapshot, and that even though it got brigaded by racists, your efforts and answers and effort were appreciated. And every year when we repost it each Indigenous Peoples Day, it doesn't necessarily get a lot of upvotes, but it inspires more positive, fruitful discussions about these issues. So what can we learn about these stories to show how intersectional moderation or thinking intersectionally about moderation can enable freedom to speak and from oppression? So I'm going to break it down by each of the levels of power that I introduced earlier. And so the first is power at the interpersonal level, where power is manifested through our relationships with the people we interact with. So we can see in the second story that interpersonal relationships between moderators are really important for maintaining morale and preventing burnout. However, the way that people experience moderation work, especially the emotional labor, isn't the same. Mods who are marginalized experience it differently. So Kyle and Morgan experience that pushback differently than the white mods, and Morgan differently than the cis English-speaking mods. And while these relationships are sometimes enough, sometimes they aren't, and sometimes they actually get in the way. So the mod who wrote the initial draft of the policy that I talked about earlier was in a position of power relative to Kyle, both as a white woman, as somebody who's pursuing a PhD, and as somebody who is a more experienced and highly respected member of the moderation team. And so this made it really hard for him to push back on the policy and instead just ended up letting it die. So what can we do to address interpersonal power that can be oppressive and support interpersonal power that can be uplifting? And so one thing is to make sure, to the extent possible, that moderation teams are diverse as a form of empowerment. Because, as I'll describe on the next slide, like being able to moderate is a form of power that it's important to uplift. Another is making sure, especially that moderators who occupy positions of power related to their identity are informed. They have the information that they need to be both good allies to their colleagues, but also so that they know how moderation affects people, so that they know when to listen, how to step up, and how to support initiatives that are not going to further marginalize already marginalized people. And then at the community level, power is formed by experiences and ideas shared within members of a group. So this power can be reinforced in a couple of different ways. First is that the power that moderators have relative to users. So mods control what users can say and what they can't when they make decisions about what to remove and what they allow to remain. And so these decisions can create space for more, better, kinder, more informed content. But as we can see from the first story, it can also make space that reinforces dominant perspectives and narratives. Sometimes power at the community level can also be reinforced by users. So we saw this in the second story, where users were sending abusive messages, engaging in racist pushback, and obfuscating things that they didn't like through downvoting. And so this highlights that solutions to moderation that center democracy can actually end up working against minoritized and marginalized members of a group in what I like to describe as this kind of technological colonialism. Finally, we have power at the systemic level, which is when power is upheld by institutions and that reinforce dominant viewpoints. So proactive moderation, like answering questions and pushing back against commonly held assumptions through posts, this can all be extremely impactful. Even though that success might be limited at one point in time, we can see in the second story that it's still reaching people and still has a chance to be a powerful way to shift dominant perspectives, even years down the road after the original post is written. Ultimately, though, if we want to counter systemic power, we need to think about whose freedom of speech our policies are enabling and whose speech is being repressed or oppressed. Policies need to account for context, and one-size-fits-all approaches are not going to work. We need to be greater understanding about the strengths and deficiencies of existing policies and practices in order to create space for speech and ensure community members and moderators are free from oppression. So ultimately, if we want to address harm, moderation needs to account for power. So by drawing from Black feminist theories of power, we can learn more about how it manifests and how it affects people who are marginalized by moderation. While not all of us are in powerful positions that we can leverage, things can change. For example, when Kyle was working on that policy, he didn't feel empowered to speak up. But now he's a professor at a higher education institution, and he and I have collaborated on sharing this story, which is going to be published in an academic paper soon. And those of us who do have power can use intersectionality as a lens to help us all envision a better epistemic space that upends how we think about moderation, so that it's not just about censorship, but instead that it allows people to be free to speak and from oppression, while also protecting the moderators who are behind the scenes doing all of this important work. Thank you with a special thanks to Kyle Pittman, Morgan Lewin Campos, and the Ask Historians moderation team. And if anybody wants to do any more reading, I've published a few different papers on these topics, which you can access through the QR codes here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. That was really, really interesting. And now I'd like to turn to, and I'll say I remember when that whole thing blew up, and because Dan was letting us know that some of this was going on, and I didn't engage, just watched some of that happening, and it was very disturbing at the time. So now we're going to turn to Lisa Baer-Tsarfati, who is an ABD at the University of Guelph. And so, Lisa, the floor is yours.
So thank you, Mills. I am going to be talking today about the lessons we can learn from the Ask Historians conference. In my paper, Democratizing Public History, the Ask Historians Digital Conference as a Model for Inclusive Academic Engagement. So, in the 4 years since the COVID-19 global pandemic ushered in a reevaluation of the ways in which scholars engage with one another in the public, the landscape of scholarly and professional interaction has undergone a profound transformation. The initial disruption forced by the pandemic necessitated a rapid pivot to the digital platforms, with video conferencing tools, virtual symposia, and online content dissemination becoming indispensable. These digital spaces, which were initially perceived as temporary solutions, have since revealed enduring benefits in terms of inclusivity, equity, and accessibility. Yet, despite their proven advantages, digital platforms are often still relegated to the status of secondary options compared to the alternative of traditional in-person events. This perception persists, even as evidence increasingly suggests that online platforms can significantly enhance participation and inclusivity by eliminating many of the barriers associated with traditional academic and professional events, such as cost, travel, and physical accessibility. The Ask Historians Digital Conference, hereafter AHDC, held on Reddit in 2020 and 2021, serves as a paradigm of how digital spaces can democratize scholarly engagement. Unlike traditional academic conferences, which come with significant financial, logistical, and accessibility barriers, the AHDC was free and open to anyone with internet access. By utilizing Reddit, a platform with a global, diverse user base, the AHDC transcended the conventional limitations of academic conferences, reaching a far wider audience. Moreover, this online conference not only maintained the rigor and depth of traditional scholarly events, but also democratized the dissemination of knowledge. It welcomed early career researchers, students, and scholars from traditionally marginalized backgrounds, thereby broadening the spectrum of voices in academic discourse. The AHDC demonstrated that digital platforms could be leveraged to create more equitable academic environments, challenging the notion that high-quality scholarly exchange must take place in person. This paper argues that digital spaces should not be viewed merely as stopgap solutions, but as transformative venues for scholarly and even professional engagement. Drawing from Black feminist theory, particularly the concept of intersectionality, this paper underscores the importance of reimagining academic spaces in order to address systemic inequities. By embracing the inclusivity and accessibility inherent in digital platforms, scholars can foster dialogues that are not only more equitable, but also more socially responsible. The AHDC serves as a case study in this regard, illustrating how digital platforms can be harnessed to practice socially responsible and inclusive public history. This paper will explore the structural advantages of digital events over traditional ones, the specific ways in which the AHDC broadened participation, and the theoretical underpinnings that support the use of digital spaces to enhance scholarly equity and inclusivity. By examining the principles of Black feminist theory and the successes of the AHDC, this paper will challenge the academic community to rethink the potential of digital platforms. It will argue for a more permanent and proactive adoption of these spaces to foster a more inclusive, accessible, and socially responsible academic future. Traditional scholarly events, while long-standing pillars of academic exchange, bring with them a range of limitations that can hinder inclusivity and accessibility. The most evident barriers are financial and logistical. Attending an in-person conference often requires significant investment in travel, accommodation, and registration fees, which can be prohibitive for many scholars, particularly those early in their careers or from underfunded institutions. These costs disproportionately affect researchers from marginalized backgrounds who may already face systemic inequities within academia. Furthermore, the physical accessibility of traditional conferences is a critical issue. Venues may not be adequately equipped to accommodate individuals with disabilities, and the structure of in-person events can be challenging for neurodiverse participants. The format of traditional conferences, rigid schedules, physically demanding environments, and unspoken social norms can create additional barriers for those who find these settings difficult to navigate. Another underserved community whose needs are not often taken into consideration are academics who are also full-time caregivers, for whom travel may be an impossibility, or nursing mothers who may require safe and private spaces to pump milk or to nurse their infants. Another significant limitation is the geographic concentration of prestigious academic events. Major conferences are often held in well-funded institutions in the global north, making it difficult for scholars from the global south to attend due to visa restrictions, travel costs, and the time commitment required. This geographic bias not only limits the diversity of participants, but also reinforces existing academic hierarchies, where scholars with better access to resources have greater opportunities to present and network. Digital events, by contrast, offer a more inclusive, equitable, and accessible alternative to traditional scholarly gatherings. The cost of participation in digital conferences is significantly lower, eliminating travel and accommodation expenses. This reduction in financial barriers opens the door for a more diverse array of participants, including early career researchers, students, and scholars from underrepresented regions and backgrounds. The accessibility of digital events is another advantage. Online platforms can be designed to accommodate a wide range of needs, including closed captioning and text-to-speech options for participants with sensory disabilities, and flexible schedules that allow participants to engage with content at their own pace. The asynchronous nature of many digital conferences means that sessions can be recorded and accessed later, providing greater flexibility for those with caregiving responsibilities, non-traditional academics who may work outside of academia, or those with other time constraints. Digital platforms also offer unique opportunities for global participation. By removing the need for physical travel, digital conferences can attract a more geographically diverse audience. This inclusivity enhances the richness of scholarly discourse, bringing together perspectives from around the world that might otherwise be excluded. Moreover, the anonymity and openness of online platforms like Reddit can democratize participation, allowing voices to be heard based on the merit of their contributions rather than their institutional affiliations or credentials. The AHDC exemplifies the potential of digital events to overcome the limitations of traditional scholarly gatherings. By utilizing a widely accessible platform and emphasizing inclusivity and accessibility, the AHDC provided a model for how digital spaces can facilitate more equitable academic engagement. The conference's success underscores the argument that digital platforms should be viewed as legitimate and valuable venues for scholarly exchange rather than mere stopgap solutions. While the AHDC was conceived as a response to the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic, it evolved into a pioneering model for digital scholarly engagement. Hosted on Reddit, the AHDC aimed to create an open access, public-oriented conference that transcended traditional academic boundaries. The decision to use Reddit was strategic, leveraging the platform's global reach and relatively accessible platform to democratize the dissemination of historical knowledge. The objectives of the AHDC were multifaceted: to provide a free and accessible forum for the exchange of ideas, to include voices traditionally marginalized in academic discourse, and to maintain the rigor and depth of conventional scholarly conferences. The format of the conference included pre-recorded presentations, live networking sessions, and asynchronous discussions, allowing participants to engage with the content on their own terms. The impact of the AHDC was significant, with participation statistics and demographics reflecting a broad and diverse audience. In 2020, the conference featured 42 speakers and moderators across 8 panels, 2 roundtables, and a keynote address. Of these participants, 50% identified as women and 5% identified as non-binary. Racial diversity was also notable, with 32 participants identifying as white and 10 as Indigenous, Asian, or Latinx. In 2021, the numbers increased to 45 speakers and moderators across 9 panels, 1 roundtable, and a keynote address, with 51% identifying as women and 4% as non-binary. Racial diversity included 11 participants identifying as Black, Indigenous, Asian, or Latinx, and 34 participants identifying as white. Geographic diversity was another highlight, with participants tuning in from 5 continents and 9 time zones. This global reach was facilitated by the low cost of participation, as the AHDC eliminated the need for travel, accommodation, and registration fees. The conference was entirely free for all participants, including speakers, moderators, and the audience. The feedback from participants underscored the accessibility and inclusivity of the event. Many attendees noted that the digital format allowed them to participate in ways that would not have been possible at a traditional in-person conference. Disabled and neurodiverse scholars in particular highlighted the benefits of the asynchronous format and the various accommodations provided, such as closed captioning and text-to-speech options. The AHDC's success demonstrated the potential for digital platforms to facilitate more inclusive and equitable scholarly engagement. By breaking down financial, logistical, and accessibility barriers, the conference provided a model for how digital events can democratize academic discourse. In this way, the AHDC set a new standard for accessibility and public orientation in academic conferences. By choosing Reddit as its platform, the conference ensured that participation was free and accessible to anyone with an internet connection. This eliminated the financial barriers typically associated with academic conferences, making it possible for a wider range of participants to engage with the event. The conference organizers prioritized accessibility from the outset. This included ensuring that all pre-recorded materials were closed captioned, providing text hierarchies and appropriate contrast for participants relying on assistive technologies, and employing platforms like Gather, which offered both mouse and keyboard navigation for participants with mobility disabilities. These accommodations made the conference more accessible to disabled and neurodiverse scholars who often face significant barriers to attending in-person events. The asynchronous format of the AHDC provided additional flexibility. Participants could view recorded panels at their convenience, allowing them to engage with the content on their own schedules. This was particularly beneficial for individuals with caregiving responsibilities, those in different time zones, and participants who needed more time to process the information. The asynchronous format also enabled co-panelists and moderators to build rapport and seek help from conference organizers before and during recording, enhancing the overall quality of the presentations. One of the most significant achievements of the AHDC was its intentional inclusion of marginalized voices. The conference organizers made deliberate efforts to welcome early career researchers, students, and scholars from diverse backgrounds. This was achieved through the adoption of several strategies. Participation on the AskHistorians subreddit is based on demonstrated knowledge and the ability to communicate information about the past in an accessible and engaging manner, rather than on traditional academic credentials. This principle was carried over to the AHDC, where speakers were selected based on the quality of their proposals and their potential to contribute to meaningful scholarly dialogue. Additionally, the AHDC's organizers were intentional about creating diverse panels. In both 2020 and 2021, the conference achieved near gender parity and included a significant number of BIPOC participants. The 2021 conference featured speakers and moderators from 5 continents, representing every career stage from undergraduate students to university faculty, and concerted efforts were made to ensure that no, quote, "manels" would be produced for the conference's programming. Each panel was created to include a gender diverse group of speakers and/or moderators to enrich the perspectives represented in each session's discussion. To further highlight marginalized perspectives, the AHDC's organizers selected each conference's themes carefully to support this mission. The 2020 conference themed Business as Unusual, Histories of Rupture, Chaos, Revolution, and Change, centered on issues relating to disruption and change, often propelled by marginalized populations. The 2021 theme, Deleted and Missing History, Reconstructing the Past, Confronting Distortions, addressed ongoing efforts to confront systemic racism and historical distortions, furthering the inclusion of diverse voices. Finally, the digital format and accessibility accommodations made it possible for disabled and neurodiverse scholars to participate fully. The conference also included synchronous activities, such as panel Q&A sessions modeled after the Ask Me Anything format on Reddit, which were moderated to remove bad faith questions and irrelevant comments. This approach created a safer and more inclusive environment for all participants. Of course, no event is perfect, and the AHDC provided valuable lessons in organizing and executing a digital conference. Key takeaways include recognizing the importance of allowing for enough time for planning. Organizing a digital conference requires significant time and effort. The 2020 AHDC was organized in just 3 months, while the 2021 conference benefited from a longer planning period. This additional time allowed for better preparation and reduced stress for the organizers. Continuous improvement in accessibility is essential. For the 2021 conference, the organizers developed an abstract writing guide to invite greater participation from undergraduate students and those without formal academic training. Calls for papers were translated into multiple languages to increase global participation. Intentional efforts to diversify participation proved successful. The establishment of a subcommittee on diversity, inclusion, and accessibility ensured that conference materials and language were appropriate and inclusive. Preferring papers dealing with histories of marginalized subjects also helped achieve a more diverse range of presentations. The use of digital platforms like Reddit and Gather, along with the asynchronous format, significantly enhanced accessibility and participation. However, ongoing attention to technical issues and participant support is crucial for success. For instance, I have been clear throughout this paper that increased accessibility to digital events is contingent upon prospective participants having access to a reliable and unrestricted internet connection. For communities in areas of the world where such infrastructure is not yet available, or for those living in regions where internet access is restricted or monitored, digital events may not be as accessible. Still, it is clear that the AHDC's achievements highlight the potential of digital platforms to foster inclusive and equitable scholarly engagement in a broad sense. By addressing systemic barriers and prioritizing accessibility, the conference set a new standard for what academic events can achieve in the digital age. Black feminist theory, particularly the concept of intersectionality, provides a critical framework for understanding and addressing systemic inequities in academic spaces. Sarah has already introduced us to the concept of intersectionality and the importance it plays in recognizing and addressing the multiple intersecting identities that individuals hold, and how these intersections contribute to unique experiences of oppression. In the context of academic engagement, intersectionality highlights the need for inclusive practices that consider the diverse backgrounds and experiences of all participants. Traditional academic spaces often fail to account for these intersecting identities, resulting in environments that privilege certain voices while marginalizing others. By reimagining academic spaces through the lens of intersectionality, scholars can work towards creating more equitable and inclusive environments that recognize and value the contributions of all individuals. The inclusion of diverse perspectives is essential for fostering a rich and robust scholarly discourse. Diverse voices bring unique insights and experiences that can challenge dominant narratives and contribute to a more comprehensive understanding of complex issues. Black feminist theory emphasizes the value of these diverse perspectives, arguing that the inclusion of marginalized voices is not only a matter of equity, but also enhances the quality of scholarly work. Incorporating intersectionality into academic spaces involves creating opportunities for scholars from diverse backgrounds to participate fully and meaningfully. This means addressing systemic barriers to participation, such as financial and logistical constraints, as well as fostering an environment that respects and values different ways of knowing and communicating. By doing so, academic spaces can become more inclusive and representative of the broader society they aim to serve. Indeed, the concept of intersectionality can and should be applied to event and engagement organization itself. One of the reasons that the AHDC was so successful was because the organizing committee itself included individuals who were themselves members of traditionally marginalized communities, and it was their perspectives and their experiences that shaped the decisions that were made when developing the AHDC as an event for online scholarly discourse and exchange. Digital platforms offer unique opportunities to apply the principles of Black feminist theory and intersectionality to academic engagement. The flexibility, accessibility, and global reach of digital spaces can help overcome many of the barriers that exist in traditional academic settings. By leveraging these advantages, digital platforms can facilitate more inclusive and equitable scholarly dialogues. The AHDC is a prime example of how digital spaces can embody the principles of Black feminist theory. The conference's commitment to inclusivity, accessibility, and the democratization of knowledge reflects the core tenets of intersectionality. By prioritizing diverse voices and creating an environment that welcomes all participants, regardless of their background or credentials, the AHDC demonstrated how digital platforms can be used to practice socially responsible and inclusive scholarship. The AHDC's approach to inclusivity and accessibility was therefore rooted in the principles of Black feminist theory. Specific diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility principles were put into practice in several ways. First, as already noted, we provided free access and open participation. By eliminating financial barriers, the AHDC ensured that anyone with internet access could participate, regardless of their economic background. This inclusivity was fundamental to the conference's success in attracting a diverse array of participants. Next, the conference organizers prioritized accessibility, implementing measures such as closed captioning, text-to-speech options, and flexible scheduling. These accommodations made the conference more accessible to disabled and neurodiverse scholars, ensuring that all participants could engage fully with the content. Finally, the AHDC's commitment to diversity was reflected in its speaker selection and panel composition. By actively seeking out and including scholars from historically marginalized backgrounds, the conference amplified voices that are often excluded from traditional academic spaces. The AHDC provided a platform for early career researchers and students to share their work, recognizing the importance of supporting emerging scholars. This approach helped democratize the dissemination of knowledge, valuing contributions based on their merit rather than on institutional affiliation. By utilizing a digital platform, the AHDC attracted participants from around the world, enhancing the diversity of perspectives and experiences represented at the conference. This global reach was a testament to the potential of digital spaces to facilitate inclusive scholarly engagement. This paper has demonstrated that the experiences of events like the AHDC challenge the lingering perception that digital events and engagements are still somehow inferior to in-person alternatives, illustrating that digital spaces can be legitimate and effective venues for scholarly exchange. The flexibility, accessibility, and inclusivity offered by digital platforms make them valuable tools for fostering more equitable academic dialogues. Evidence from the AHDC and other digital conferences suggests that online engagement can provide long-term benefits. These include increased participation from diverse and underrepresented groups, greater accessibility for disabled and neurodiverse scholars, and the potential to reach a global audience. By embracing digital platforms as integral components of academic engagement, scholars can create more inclusive and socially responsible academic environments. That being said, organizing and promoting digital conferences requires careful planning and consideration of various factors to ensure their success. Based on the experiences of the AHDC, the following strategies can help in implementing effective and inclusive digital events. Allow sufficient time for planning and organizing the event. This includes coordinating with speakers, setting up the digital platform, and ensuring that all necessary accommodations are in place. Develop a call for papers that encourages participation from a diverse range of scholars. Consider translating the call into multiple languages to reach a broader audience. Prioritize accessibility by implementing measures such as closed captioning, text-to-speech options, and flexible scheduling. Ensure that the digital platform is user-friendly and accessible to all participants. Actively seek out and include speakers from marginalized backgrounds. Consider the diversity of perspectives when organizing panels and sessions. Provide technical support and training for participants to ensure they can navigate the digital platform effectively. Offer one-on-one meetings and pre-event briefings to address any concerns. Design the event to encourage engagement and interaction among participants. This can include live Q&A sessions, asynchronous discussions, and virtual networking events. Collect feedback from participants to identify areas for improvement. Use this feedback to enhance future events and ensure continuous improvement in accessibility and inclusivity. The Ask Historians Digital Conference serves as a powerful case study in the transformative potential of digital platforms for scholarly engagement. By leveraging the accessibility, inclusivity, and global reach of digital spaces, the AHDC demonstrated how online academic events could democratize the dissemination of knowledge and foster more equitable scholarly dialogues. The conference's success challenges the perception of digital platforms as mere stopgap solutions, highlighting their potential as legitimate and valuable venues for academic exchange. As we look to the future, it is clear that digital platforms have a vital role to play in the evolution of academic engagement. The success of the AHDC demonstrates that online events can break down traditional barriers and create more inclusive and accessible academic spaces. By embracing the opportunities offered by digital platforms, the academic community can work towards a future where scholarly engagement is truly equitable and representative of diverse voices. In conclusion, the Ask Historians Digital Conference has set a precedent for how digital platforms can be utilized to democratize scholarly engagement. By prioritizing accessibility, inclusivity, and the principles of intersectionality, the AHDC has shown that digital spaces can foster richer, more diverse, and more socially responsible academic dialogues. As the academic community continues to adapt to the digital age, it is essential to recognize the value of these platforms and proactively adopt them to create a more inclusive and accessible academic future. This paper calls on scholars, institutions, and conference organizers to rethink their approaches to academic engagement and to embrace the transformative potential of digital platforms. By doing so, we can build a more equitable and inclusive academic landscape that benefits all members of the scholarly community. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. That was really interesting. I really appreciate those comments. And now we will turn to Dan Howlett. Dan is a PhD candidate in the ABD status at my own institution, George Mason University. And so, Dan, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Mills. Just to start off with my visual introduction, I'm a white male presenting person with short brown hair and black glasses. I'm wearing a purple shirt and purple tie with a blue jacket over it. So my paper is the 20-year rule, historical context for current events on Ask Historians. On August 14th, 2021, the New York Times front page read, "The Afghan military is built over 20 years. How did it collapse so quickly?" And the Ask Historians subreddit's most upvoted or liked posts of the day ask, how did Afghanistan go from being relatively stable 50 to 60 years ago to the constantly devolving mess it is today? The subreddit's highest and most upvoted post of all time is a meta, or it's a moderator-sanctioned essay post that contextualizes a major news event on the U.S. Capitol insurrection on January 6, 2021. This was posted and viewed by thousands of users 90 minutes before U.S. Capitol Police declared the building secure. These are not unique correlations between the engagement of Reddit users and historical content tied to current events on the forum. This paper also includes a case study of posts containing the word Afghanistan 2021, as well as a discussion of these meta posts and its role in shaping the discourse on the subreddit tied to current events within the context of Ask Historians rules and policies. While we forbid discussion of modern politics, posts that often invoke or frame historical questions with current events are allowed, and Redditors frequently come to the platform to understand the world around them. If we get massive public audiences to utilize platforms like Reddit to interpret what's going on and use the past as a way to understand what's happening, we have to question what historians have as a responsibility to use and reinvent our discipline in this digital context. So first, let me just go over what the rules of Ask Historians are for this no current events. We don't allow discussion of topics that are less than 20 years old. This is to discourage anything that is off topic, modern politics. And while this rule is slightly flexible to include historiography and events that do not fit neatly into the calendar year, so if something spills over into January of the next year, there is some wiggle room. But for Ask Historians, every year on New Year's Day, we inaugurate the next year into the Ask Historians allowable events with a meta post saying these events are welcome. So for 2024, we've now welcomed some things like Shrek 2 and the National Treasure movie for their release dates, as well as the start of Facebook. However, it does mean things like the impact of Facebook go well past that 20-year guideline. So you can talk about Zuckerberg leading up to Facebook, but you can't really talk about the impact yet. This is, as we explained in the Rules Roundtable, to just prevent discussion that isn't really going to allow evidence-based historical work that's up to our expectations. And when users post questions that are out of our scope, we do recommend other subreddits for them that they can bring their inquiry to. However, we do understand that users often have historical questions that are very tied and directly framed with current events, and we want people to bring those questions to us. In the 2 weeks prior to filming this panel, the first US presidential debate has been a major topic, and we've seen questions like, did FDR's declining health lead to any poor leadership or bad decisions while he was still alive? How was it treated by his advisors and staff? President Wilson had a stroke in office. Eisenhower had a heart attack. Why weren't they forced out of office? And in the context of the US Supreme Court's decision to grant presidential immunity to official acts, is this the first time American democracy has been perceived to be in jeopardy? And this last question directly mentions the SCOTUS ruling. These are all allowable because they are asking for historical context, not asking to discuss current events. And the two presidential questions don't even reference President Biden, but it's pretty clear in context that this is where these questions are coming from. So I wanted to offer this case study to add some data to the qualitative observations that moderators have had over the years, noticing upticks in certain events, bringing significant amounts of historical questions that are not so subtle in what they're asking about. So to contextualize this paper, I want to introduce this concept of rogue archiving by Terry Lee Harrell. In her paper on the January 6th experience on Reddit, Harrell talks about how Reddit became a rogue archive. So different subreddits popped up like capital consequences and data hoarders, where users were preserving information and data from the January 6th insurrection while it was ongoing and the lingering consequences after. And Harold says users responding to January 6th by archiving its digital ephemera might not approach archiving with the same training and practices as professional archivists, but they provide a window into the value archives hold for everyday people and how and why people remember or want to remember their lived experiences. So even though this is a decentralized and self-organized method, they created an archive of reactions to January 6th and what will be primary sources that even people on like data hoarders were downloading and saving in their computers all over the globe just to preserve the day. And the January 6th subreddit that popped up afterwards even introduces itself as January 6th, 2021 will live in infamy. These are historic times. Let's document them together. Now, Ask Historians is not really a rogue archive in the same sense because we are not seeking out to collect anything. That's not the purpose of the subreddit. But it is part of this historical ecosystem on Reddit where users are making the past relevant to themselves today and providing something for the future, and historians can use and understand responses by Reddit's audience. And Ask Historians provides this really unique set of information because we get textual data of the questions, we get textual data of answers, and social media metrics related to both of those things. So for this case study, I compiled 162 questions that included the term Afghanistan over the year 2021. This just happened to be the topic that was trending at the time. I am not a Middle Eastern historian. I look at early New England, but I decided this is something outside my expertise. So this is where I can understand the experience of people going to Reddit who don't really know about a topic and are trying to learn something about it through this forum. And I use only the posts that talk about Afghanistan specifically. So it has to include the word Afghanistan. I collected posts as they came in that were approved by moderators. And I also went back and searched to make sure I got them all. So these were all findable through Reddit's search function. Some posts may have been deleted since then, but even some that were deleted were still searchable for me. So we can also think about how this is a back catalog that users can still go to and find information about current events long after and during. So just a few observations first. This is 162 questions. That is really small for the number of posts we get on Ask Historians. We get over 100 a day, 100 to 125 would not be abnormal in that range. And in 2021, I went and looked at our metrics on the back end of Ask Historians. We had over 39,000 posts submitted in the year that stayed up. So this is less than half a percentage point. So Afghanistan is a nation with thousands of years of history, but really not showing up on the subreddit that often. We have not done a study to look at how Western versus non-Western topics appear on the subreddit, but I would not be shocked to find a very heavy Western bias. And the extent of that bias is probably pretty significant, but that's where this data is coming from. Users are likely to ask questions related to things that they know about. So there could be some questions coming from what people's experiences are in their own education and in pop culture. Ask Historians is an English language subreddit. It's on the internet, so there are barriers to entry there from other places as well. So how and why people ask questions will have a lot of different variables, but I think it's useful to understand the context of what Sarah talked about, this audience online that is largely white, male, and Western. Because it also gives us an opportunity to think about how are they understanding this history and how else do we want to reach out to other people who maybe aren't represented here. And I pull out one of these posts here. What did slavery look like in Afghanistan before its abolition in 1923? Because I think it's a really interesting one. This came in on August 15th, 2021, which was during the height of these posts asking about the US withdrawal in Afghanistan. So when the US withdrew in August, there were some posts leading up to it, and over the time of the withdrawal in mid to late August and following into September, we got lots of questions related to the Soviet Union invasion of Afghanistan, but we also got questions that weren't fully tied to this most recent comparison. And I want to point out that this one says, I was reading Wikipedia. So when we have questions like this, we often get references. 20 of the 162 questions in this data set have some reference to reading an external source like Wikipedia or a news article, so we can follow this path. Like, this is not explicitly about a current event. It's not related to a military withdrawal in Afghanistan or anywhere else in the world, but it's pretty clear in the context that someone's looking at Wikipedia to understand what's happening, and they follow the path from Wikipedia to Reddit, both free and digital resources. And that's not necessarily where historians are to help educate people and share our knowledge. So we should consider how these resources are being used and figure out how we have to meet people where they are, because this question went unanswered, but it's a great question. So let's just look at this text and see what's being asked. So this is a word cloud of the terms that were most frequently asked. It's using the raw frequency, and Afghanistan, obviously, as the word that I chose to follow, is the most frequent term in these posts. But you can see that there's several other words in there that stand out, like Soviet and Taliban and Vietnam. Those were all in the top 10 words. So what we're seeing is that people were making historical connections in their minds between the Soviet Union withdrawal from Afghanistan, as well as the American withdrawal from Vietnam. So the Soviet Union one was much more explicit in news media coverage, and there were more references to it. Vietnam, I would say, was slightly less referenced, but it was not an unheard of reference in the media coverage. But people are making those connections because they're trying to understand how the past and present are going together. And I think it's interesting to see that you can have this kind of step around these like greater stepping stones to more unique and less tangential questions, or more questions that get further into the past. Because one post that went even further, and it asked, did Macedonian battle tactics and equipment evolve to deal with the guerrilla war in Afghanistan? How did Alexander overcome the problems that have humbled so many invaders? And that's a comparison that no one else had made on the subreddit. But I think it's worth noting that this user has a flare next to its name. So it's that little banner that says Interesting Inquirer. AskHistorians has a panel of flared users, which means they get this text banner next to their name. And for the most part, it's for users who have demonstrated a subject matter expertise in a content area where they answer questions. They apply for this flare and moderators grant it to them so that readers of the subreddit can see that someone answered the question and they have shown a history of answering questions in this field for a long time. A few users have this Interesting Inquirer flare because they've shown a history of asking interesting questions. So the fact that this user comes in with this very unique question, I think it shows that, one, there are lots of people who are asking questions about current events and about history, and they're coming to the internet to learn about it. But those users who have this Interesting Inquirer flair are an example of how the more you ask questions, the more unique and creative your comparisons can become when you're asking questions about the past and current events. So thinking about that, this is a way we can think about what is our responsibility and how can we reinvent history and humanities to reach people who are seeking information like this from our subfields. Because a lot of historians have been reluctant to comment on current events. We are reluctant to be too political sometimes, but people are seeking this sort of information from us. And so I want to also look at, when were these questions asked? So this graph shows the Google News interest rates between April and October of 2021. Over the 6-month period, it's on a scale of 0 to 100, where 100 is the maximum. It's 100% of the interest on Google News generated by articles, including Afghanistan, on that topic. And then on the bottom row, you have the access for the single day post count. So there was one day where we received 8 questions, including the word Afghanistan. There was one day where we had 7 questions, one day with 5, one day with 4. And you can see that those days where there were more posts on Afghanistan using that word was also when Afghanistan was more popular on Google News. So there is a linear relationship between what news media is covering and how many questions we're getting on Ask Historians. And you can see that there is kind of this standard of around 40% of the news interest in comparison is where it kind of peters out a little bit and it gets a little messier. And I think more study and looking at this question can find out what exactly is the relationship beyond this one example. And those dates that had the most posts going in descending order were August 16th, 17th, 18th, and 15th. So it's also during this 1 week period that there was this high interest on the subreddit. Now, just because it is posted, it doesn't mean it gets an answer. And that's the frequent complaint on Ask Historians, that there are no answers, to the point where users even say they'd rather read a wrong answer than have no answer at all. Ask Historians will never allow for that standard of our moderation. But of these 162 questions, only 48 received answers. That's around 30%, which is slightly below the average for the subreddit of answered questions that year. However, looking at the timeline of those answers, that's a little bit of a misleading statistic. So you can see on this graph, the orange is representative of the questions that did receive an answer, and the blue is representative of the questions that did not receive an answer. And you can see that there's a higher rate of answers happening in August. You get a net increase in answers compared to other months. And that net increase lasted into September and starts to fade out again in October. So there's about a 2-month surge in interest, and then it starts to fade out and go back to its normal levels when it comes onto our subreddit. Over that 2-month period in August and September, that's 48% of the questions that included Afghanistan. So 79 of the 162. 22 of the posts received an answer in that 2-month period. So that's 11 per month, whereas the remaining months averaged less than 3 answers. So while this may appear like there are not many questions were answered, at the time when people wanted that information, people were getting it. And the reason that many of these questions probably went unanswered is that we do rely on flared users and users to share their expertise. Many of these questions were repetitive. So if you've answered on August 15th a question about Afghanistan and a similar question shows up on August 17th, you've already answered something similar. So a lot of these questions do go unanswered because one gets really popular, and then the other questions are a little less popular, so they might go unanswered, but there is still content answering a question related to your topic that is likely covering your current event question. And looking at that, I want to show how the originality of answers comes into play here. So this is a graph showing the cumulative upvotes of answers that were received each month. And you can see that August received a lot of upvotes on its answers. Answers in August received over 4,000 upvotes, way more than any other month. And on this graph, what I do is with the colors is that orange is showing answers that had a past answer link in them, and blue is showing entirely original answers. So I want to highlight that that back catalog of Ask Historians answers is clearly getting utilized. So in August, almost all of that is from one post. About 3,500 of the upvotes referenced for August answers is the main post that trended of that month. There were other ones that were popular and received a few hundred upvotes, but then that's what gets referenced in the October past answer linked questions. So once users answer something related to current events, you can see that there is a little bit of a lag in when original and fully original answers show up. But then in October, when those original answers aren't coming, there are references to those original answers just 2 months ago. So users are taking care of the back catalog to provide answers. And those past answer links are super important for the subreddit. One, because it means that a user who is not an expert can just go and reference and say, here's the link to an answer that's similar to your question. We have flared users that are FAQ finders who serve this purpose for us. It also means that a subject matter expert is not required to both see the post and have the time and inclination to answer a question. And it means that their original work is still getting shared and still being utilized. So it's not just answer a question and social media memory holds it a few days later. Ask Historians can be a resource to gather a lot of information. And while this shows a clear effect of current events showing up on Ask Historians, and I think it's fantastic. I love that people are coming to Reddit to learn things. Not every event gets historicized in the same way. There are topics that do not trend on Ask Historians that do not see high post counts. Afghanistan is one of them. But in November of 2021, the not guilty verdict in the Kyle Rittenhouse trial for the shooting deaths of 2 people during the Black Lives Matter protests did not correlate to any influx of questions involving the histories of racism, law, vigilantism. I kept searching just to see if this trend is unique to Afghanistan and military history topics. It's not fully unique to that, but certain topics don't get the same link to historical events. Same for this year, the French and UK election results didn't have a lot of trending posts or questions about the political histories of either nation. Meanwhile, whenever violence flares up in Israel and Palestine, so in spring of 2021 and fall of 2023, we saw a huge influx in questions asking about it. Same thing happened in February 2021 with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. These had initial media storms that flooded our subreddit with questions, but those have also since faded. We don't have a lot of questions about Israel and Palestine still coming through despite ongoing violence. One explanation may be the popularity of military history on Reddit, and that these long-term conflicts that have a clearer history makes it easier for users to ask historical questions. It may be that like US recent presidential events are easier for our audience, especially since it is probably US centric, to ask questions and have a bit more information. So it does depend on what the media saturation is of certain news items. And I hope that further study can identify some of these causes of what does and does not get historicized, because like that slavery in 1920s Afghanistan question shows, questions tied to current events are not solely tied to political history, and people can explore topics further down. And now one way Ask Historian moderators have tried to connect events to the past is through meta posts. These meta posts have been typically states of the subreddit, but Ask Historians on a few times has included meta posts providing an essay-like context to major news events. It's been a while, I think about 2 years since our last one in this style, although we do often have mega threads, which are threads of just links to relevant information without commentary. These meta posts do include some historical commentary. And we had one on George Floyd after his murder about US police brutality against Black people, and one on the Atlanta murders in 2021, where anti-Asian racism was clearly at play. So as I discuss these, I do want to reference my co-panelist Sarah's research on Ask Historians with the quote from one of her articles, where a moderator described it as, "I run the world's largest historical outreach project, and it's on a cesspool of a website." Because while it is a nice rosy picture that people come and want to learn history and understand the world through Reddit, there are some bad things. So when Ask Historians wrote on these 2 topics, the posts received a lot of upvotes. The George Floyd meta received 38,000 upvotes and over 800 comments. The Atlanta meta received 8,000 upvotes and 270 comments. That's a lot of engagement and showed a lot of people had interest in these topics and the historical context that we provided. However, Redditors are also able to report posts for violating content policies and also unique policies to the subreddit. Moderators will receive these reports and then can either act on removing the content or reapproving it. And each of these meta posts received over 50 reports referencing the 20-year rule. So it does show that users are familiar with the content policies of Ask Historians to say this is a modern event, it's within the 20 years, this isn't supposed to be allowed. But it also means that bad actors can use our rules to try to tell us that something doesn't belong in a history subreddit. And when we provided this context to the crisis of racialized violence, those bad actors want to litigate the appropriateness of these posts as history rather than engage with the content or historical realities of these long-term violent trends. Users can also write custom reports into the text field and then submit that to the moderators. And on each meta post, users embarked in racist attacks for these two posts. On the George Floyd meta, custom reports included racial, ableist, and queer slurs, as well as reports that endorsed racial violence. On the Atlanta meta, the pushback took a slightly different turn, where users questioned the assertion that the shootings were racially motivated. The police declared that the perpetrator acted due to a sex addiction conflicting with his religious beliefs after he relapsed when he visited a massage parlor, and that shooter went on to target 2 Asian massage parlors and kill 8 people, including 6 Asian women. It sparked a debate about the definition of a hate crime in this context, and Wikipedia even has the hate crime debate as a section characterizing this event. The post argued in the meta, quote, whether or not these businesses provide sexual services, the fact remains that Asian women have been so racially sexualized in North American culture that people automatically assume Asian massage therapists are sex workers. So people wanted to use the shooter's own claims to deny the racism inherent in this event. And dozens of reports called it misinformation and speculation, as well as the George Floyd meta received those too. But it showed a lot of resistance to how we historicize certain things. On the Atlanta meta, I just want to note that it had about 1/5 of the upvotes and 1/3 of the comments, but it received about as many reports of misinformation and soapboxing and violating of the 20 years rule as the George Floyd meta. So it was a much higher rate of reports, despite being much less engaged with on other social media metrics. And I present these 2 examples to show that contextualizing historical events on Reddit does receive pushback, and that it further emphasizes the need of content moderation to remove public-facing commentary by those bad actors who certainly did try to comment and post on these subjects as well. But there is also a benefit here. A lot of users enjoyed these posts. So in response to the George Floyd meta, one user wrote, "Thank you a million times over for this post, exactly what's needed in this moment." Another wrote, "Phenomenal post from the only sub I've thought of as consistently good. Thank you to the mod team for this, and if you don't mind, I'll share this post with link and full attribution for friends and followers." And on the Atlanta post, a user quoted a section from the post talking about the myth of the model minority and said, "Well, shit, that explains a lot. Learned a little bit about history, learned a little bit about myself and how to frame recent events. Thanks." So thousands of people saw these posts and engaged with it in good faith and learned about the past, despite these bad actors coming in and harassing the post too. And none of this has to happen on Reddit necessarily. There are other ways historians can have these fast responses. They can use podcasts, YouTube, and TikTok. And I don't bring these examples of great things happening to my or the other moderators' horns here, because none of this is possible without users providing answers, without all the millions of readers that we have. There's a lot of work that goes into all of this. And I want to close on what I think is one of the most important examples we can talk about this time to think about how historians' responsibility is shaped in the world today with current events. As I mentioned in the beginning, the meta post that is our most popular post is on the US Capitol attack on January 6th. It received 57,000 upvotes and nearly 700 comments. It was written, and posted while the siege of the building occurred and viewed by thousands of users while the police were still clearing the building. The author wrote about tense American elections and political violence in the 19th century to make a point about similar histories, but that nothing like January 6th had occurred in the US. And dozens of users chimed in with examples of sedition, fascism, and coups from their own subfields. A commenter wrote, "Thanks to all the historians for the write-ups of other coups. Before this thread, I thought that this was just another tantrum by a small minority of bad actors. Reading how people have behaved thusly throughout history and managed to subvert democracy has convinced me that today could have been another event like this." Another user wrote, "My heartfelt thanks to the mods and OP for this context. I know we'll persevere, but my head hangs low right now. Tonight I sat my 15-year-old son down so I could explain to him that this day is something his kids will be tested on in history class." So Ask Historians was a bit of its own rogue archive, with people reacting to the attack itself. And now here's really why I think it matters right now. And what is our responsibility? I think this is a question we have to grapple with. In the wake of the US Supreme Court's decision granting presidential immunity for official acts, a decision that is going to drastically alter how the Department of Justice prosecutes former President Trump for the insurrection, a trend of questions emerged. Were the German population okay with the enabling acts of 1933? Was there a German equivalent of California as Germany descended into fascism in the 1930s? After the failed coup attempt of 1923, how long did it take for there to be widespread awareness that Germany was in danger of descending into fascism? Did Hitler pardon supporters of his that participated in the beer hall putsch when he obtained power? Are there any good examples in history of countries that had a rise in fascist ideology but was halted before full-blown fascism? I would argue that right now, this is the canary in the coal mine for historians. We are seeing people who are afraid, confused, and dismayed at the state of the world, and they are looking to history to understand what's happening. And I think we need to think about what our responsibility is and how do we need to reinvent the humanities? Do we need to jump into these cesspools? Where do we need to go to share this information when people are clearly terrified? There is a crisis going on in the world related to democracy and fascism. People are looking to the past for answers on this and other topics. What is our responsibility here as historians? How can we meet that responsibility? I think there's a lot of stuff that we need to be doing to help people through this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. That was really great from all three of our panelists. And so I have a question for each of you, and I'm going to ask the questions in order, but then I'll come back to Sarah so that you'll have a minute to ponder while I'm asking the other two questions, and then the others have longer to ponder while you're answering. So the question, because I've spent a lot of time the last several years thinking about Indigenous ways of knowing and working with educators in particular at the University of Saskatchewan. And the question I have is whether the format of Reddit, which is essentially sort of the child or grandchild of the old threaded discussion forums and privileges the typing of text, whether that format of information exchange is actually compatible with Indigenous ways of knowing, or does it, or if it's not compatible, then what kinds of problems does that create for further thinking about Indigenous history, Indigenous culture, that sort of thing? So it's really a format of the platform question. For Lisa, I really appreciate your remarks about academic conferences. I was the president of a scholarly society a number of years ago, the International Society for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, and we did a lot during my 3 years on the presidential team to try to break down a lot of the barriers that you were describing and moving toward a more equitable model using digital tools. And our particular approach, which I haven't really seen replicated, is to say that the conference moves around the world. And so in the region where the conference happens to be in any given year, it's expected that more of the attendees from that region will be face-to-face, and that outside of that region, the majority of the attendees will be digital. And on the assumption that somebody from a graduate student in Africa is not coming to a conference in North America. And but they might be able to go to a conference in Europe because they might be able to get funding through an EU source or something like that. So, but the problem with what you presented, I think, is a problem with the way that academic societies are organized, and that is that they fund their existence through their conferences. And so the iSOTL conference every year costs around $200,000 to stage, and the organization hopes to get $250,000 in revenue coming in so that it can spend that $50,000 on the team of people who have to organize the conference. So there's an economic model issue where Reddit is, and the Reddit conference is based on a group of volunteers who are providing unpaid labor. And so then it's really a labor equity question for academic societies in general. If we're going to move to an entirely digital model, the income system for academic societies breaks, which then requires lots of unpaid labor to stage these conferences, which then pushes that labor onto people who have the time and the resources to provide that labor. And so I throw it out as like something that I have no idea what the answer is, but it is an essential problem that that I think every academic society that stages an annual conference worries about is if we go fully digital, how are we going to maintain the existence of our academic society? So that's just a question I'm curious as to your take on. And then for Dan, it's a question about the rogue archive, because in addition to being a historian, I'm also an archivist. And so what I want to know is what happens to all of those deleted comments and all of those things that are pushed off out of public view. Are they saved and are they researchable by scholars like Sarah, for instance, who's trying to understand how these conversations develop over time, or do they just get vaporized, as is the case in a database structure? So it's really sort of the tenacity or the survivability of all of the speech rather than just the speech that we see online. Because from an archival standpoint, I think the negativity is just as important as the positivity or the like sort of positive engagement in understanding how the platforms work. And because I am low on battery, I'm going to go off of video while you all answer. So Sarah, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, thanks, Mills. So I just want to start by saying that I am not an expert in Indigenous ways of knowing or Indigenous knowledge. A lot of what I know about that comes from Kyle and working closely with him on a lot of this work and co-authoring a paper that's coming out. I can speak to the format of Reddit though, and I think how that affects like how we're going to see and like how we're going to experience Indigenous ways of knowing. So whether or not it's the format is, I think, compatible with Indigenous ways of knowing our Indigenous people on Reddit, and there are people asking about questions related to Indigenous peoples like on Reddit. So whether or not Reddit is an appropriate space, it's sort of the space that we're kind of stuck with, at least in this kind of context. You know, maybe TikTok can offer other affordances that would maybe be a little bit better, but you know, this is sort of the space in the community that we have. And so I think that's where some of the understanding and the policies come into play, like how that is going to affect people's ability to share knowledge and share what they know, and making sure that we are accounting for that and recognizing that. Particularly the like education of non-Indigenous moderators is really, really important. I use that one example of the person who, you know, had identified themselves as Indigenous, had identified one of their sources as their grandmother, and it got removed. And it was actually Lisa, who I know you know exactly what incident I'm talking about. It's actually Lisa who brought this, like, after it had been removed, and brought it back and was like, hey, actually, this is a good question. This is a good answer, and this is a legit form of knowledge. But sort of the majority of the team who is not Indigenous, who is not particularly educated on like how this manifests, like, you know, nothing really happened with it. And so I think that's where providing more education to moderators and like accounting for these various contexts, like through policy and not just adopting these one size fits all kind of workarounds, is going to be really, really important. And then on the flip side, it's also really important to then communicate that out to users, because we saw from Dan's presentation that, you know, users are aware of the rules and they do expect them to be followed in a certain way, and will complain if they think that they are not. And so I'm like, you know, and Dan didn't show some of the like way more like awful pushback that we received on both of those posts, and like the horrible racism that you know, sort of we saw in a large part, you know, because people thought, you know, and because people perceived that we're violating our own rules. So being able to communicate that out with users, that be like, no, this is why we're doing it, there is a rationale, you know, that's all like sort of part of, I think, that sort of that public history work that we can do as moderators to not only, make sure that we know and that we understand and that we are applying our policies in context-specific ways, but also that users understand them so that they're not big cranky pants complaining people, that are harassing us and also our question answerers. There's also challenges that I don't know that we can overcome, like the voting system and the way that intersects with the demographics of the broader, both AskHistorians as a community and the broader demographics within Reddit itself. And that both Kyle and Morgan were getting downvoted so heavily, and basically saying you know what, reparations would actually be a really good idea right now. You should pay us for the land that you stole. People don't want to hear that, and they downvote it and it gets collapsed. So I think that there's some things that Reddit could do and some empowering that Reddit could do of its moderators to make sure that that doesn't happen. For example, we can't uncollapse comments like that, and providing us with that ability to sort of uncollapse comments in places where oppression is happening because of this system. We can't counter that. We can't do anything about the visibility there. So I think that there's also some responsibility that Reddit has in order to make sure that we can counter some of these phenomena that we are seeing, that is enabled through the technological system that it's designed.
Thank you. So Lisa.
Myself unmuted there. Before I answer your question, Mills, I realized that I forgot to give a visual introduction to myself, so I'm just going to pop that in quickly. So for our viewers, I am a female presenting person of East Asian descent with long dark hair and brown eyes. I am wearing a dark blue dress today. So then to move on to the question, which I appreciate, I should give a little bit more context about my relationship to the conference. So I was on the organizing committee of the AskHistorians conference in 2020, and then I was actually the organizing chair of the 2021 conference. And your concerns and the challenges that you've surfaced are definitely good ones. They came up while we were organizing the conferences as well, because it does cost money to produce a conference. It cost us money to produce both of those conferences as well. The 2020 conference was crowdfunded, so we actually funded that entirely through donations from members of the subreddit who very generously donated money to produce that conference. And the 2021 conference was funded entirely by Reddit, who sponsored that conference for us. So I think that one of the ways, to address that in an equitable way, would be to adopt a nonprofit model for academic societies, would be to, if they were, interested in removing registration fees entirely. I mean, you could still charge a fee to attend the conference, even if it was digital. I've seen that happen for digital conferences as well, as that you still would have to register for it. Would be to incorporate as a nonprofit and then seek funders and sponsors to defray some of that cost and to be able to pay the wages of the staff who have to organize the conference. We sought sponsorship for the AskHistorians conference. Again, like the moderators on AskHistorians, we do volunteer everything. We do it for free, but we use the funds that we raised for platform fees, for Gather, for Zoom. We used it to pay for the honorarium for the keynote speakers. And I may be misremembering this, but I think we also paid Jo for her consulting fees as well. Yeah, so we did pay for our event planner for her consulting fees. And so it is definitely a consideration. And that being said, I think that some conferences are exorbitant in the registration fees that they charge. I won't name and shame a conference, but there was a conference that I was looking at attending earlier this year, and they wanted to charge $750 for the student fee, like registration fee. And I was like, that is ridiculous. I can't afford that. So it all kind of depends, I think, on what is realistic and doable, and whether or not academic societies are interested in potentially pursuing that nonprofit model.
Yeah, thank you. And I will say, I think all academic societies that I'm aware of are nonprofits, but they typically have some version of paid staff. I mean, the American Historical Association probably employs half a dozen, maybe more people, and has a building that it has to maintain, things like it's a
Right.
very old academic society, right? But I think the bigger issue that's sort of inside what you said is that the model of the academic society is starting to break. And the Ask Historians conference, I think, is an example of how that's starting to break. And I don't think that's a bad idea at all. I think academic society models privilege a particular group of individuals and institutions. And so I'm more than happy to see them break. But that's just me. So, okay, Dan.
Yeah. So a lot of the deleted content does still exist on Reddit. As a moderator, I can go back and look at posts and see the deleted answers. So a lot of that stuff is still there, even if the public cannot view it. A lot of stuff does go away when a user comes in and deletes their own user history on the subreddit. So we have had posts that we linked to in our FAQ that a user has gone back and they've deleted their entire account, removed everything from it. And our FAQ page links to a question without an answer now. So there is a lot of stuff that does go on Reddit and then it disappears. The article about rogue archiving that I referenced talked about how the subreddit data hoarders had people who were downloading so much stuff, just terabytes of information, partly because they could. So like it does mean there were just these people out there who have downloaded so much stuff from Reddit and the internet that historians would probably love to have that maybe doesn't exist in some other places. So there are some ways that are just going to be haphazard as to like what survives from Reddit. And then Reddit does have a lot of stuff saved. And I'm going to probably tee up Sarah here to talk about this in a second, because Reddit is currently undergoing some issues with researchers and wanting to charge for APIs to scrape data from Reddit. Because Reddit just recently went public as a company. So they are now looking to generate more profit. And charging people to download and scrape their data is a way that they are considering raising some of those funds. So it used to be much more accessible. It is no longer. Like one of the sites that I would go to just to check on Reddit data was a subreddit tracker. And I went back there while preparing this paper to see, and they said because of Reddit's now closed off all its APIs and third-party apps can't use things as easily, they are no longer tracking information from Reddit because they just can't. So, Sarah, I know you have many thoughts on Reddit data and accessibility now to all of this. So do you want to comment on it?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it short. So just to clarify, they're not planning on charging researchers for access to their data. They did close down the last summer the API, or the application programming interface, which is basically I guess to put it simply, like the pipeline through which Reddit data is accessible to a variety of different people. And the reason for that is because it was being exploited by large companies to make a profit through the development of large language models and generative AI. And so they want to basically close down that pipeline to pay, to charge access for it, especially among these huge data hoarders. And so they've named a number of carve-outs to charge access to these APIs, including researchers and moderators. But sometimes but it's a limited API, and sometimes you need research or access to this data that goes beyond sort of those minimum capabilities. And so technically, they provide a way to apply for access to that, but that form that you fill out goes into like an infinite loophole of nothing. It's really like, so you can't access, if you're a researcher that needs more than the data, like that needs like more like a bigger pipe. If you need a bigger pipe, you can't get it right now, even though they say that you can. And this has also closed down access to a lot of archives that people were collecting. Push shift was the biggest one. And so that was something that researchers relied really, really heavily on, and that logged a lot of both removed content from moderators and also kept deleted content from users. And so there are some privacy issues related to some of these archives as well, and what we should do about this kind of deleted data question. And so right now that currently does not exist, like a reliable archive for researchers to access, but they still can technically access it through the API if you are collecting it sort of in real time. But if you need any kind of historical data, like the project that Dan was doing, that would be extremely difficult, I think, to do if you do not have moderator privileges right now. And there's a real gap in the resources that Reddit provides researchers right now. I know there's an initiative to work on it, but I won't get into that.
Thank you. Yeah, as a historian, it really bugs me that the information is going to get vaporized, and especially like the example that Dan gave of somebody deleting their account and then it all goes away. And one of the reasons I think about that is that I worked on a couple of projects at the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media that were sort of archive of the moment projects, the September 11th Digital Archive and the Hurricane Digital Memory Bank. And for a while, I was leading the latter of those projects. And we were looking at doing blog scraping because blogs at the time of Hurricane Katrina, Rita, and Wilma, blogs were one of the main ways that people were still writing about their experiences. And one of the things we ran into was that Katrina turns out to be a really common name. And so scraping blogs that reference the word Katrina produced a lot of chaff that we struggled to deal with at the time. But there was one blog in particular by a woman who she was in her late 50s and she was remodeling her home in New Orleans just before the storm came. And she also had stage 4 breast cancer and was dealing with that. And she was writing very poignantly about trying to finish the home moderation while undergoing the chemo and worrying about the storm and all of those things. And she had the most wonderful sense of humor about all of the tragedy she was experiencing. But she wasn't snagged by the Internet Archive and by their crawlers. And then shortly after the storm, her blog stopped. And for the rest of my life, I'll wonder what happened to her because I don't know how that story ended. And as a historian, there are tens of thousands of those stories on Reddit that you don't know how they ended. And so just people's quest for knowledge in the ways that you all have been describing. And so hopefully there'll at some point be a way of capturing all of that and saving it for future research. And so I'll end our conversation with this historical observation outside of the 20-year rule. And that is that it was either in the late 1990s or the very early 2000s that the founder of our center, Roy Rosenzweig, made a proposal to the American Historical Association that all historians presenting at the conference should be required to post their papers online 2 weeks in advance of the conference so that everyone attending the conference or just a member of the association would have access to that knowledge. And then rather than reading their papers at the conference, the historians would give a 5-minute summary and then the rest of the time would be devoted to question and answer. And historians were aghast at this proposal because if I post my paper online, people will steal my ideas. And Roy, as we can all imagine, Roy said, no, if you post your paper online, then the whole world knows that it's your idea. And if anyone tries to steal it, they'll be exposed as a thief. And historians said, yes, but if I post my paper online, then people will steal my ideas. And he couldn't make any headway on this. And so here we are in 2024, and I can guarantee you that at the 2024 annual meeting of the American Historical Association back in January. The papers were not posted online in advance. And so I say this just to say that academic historians who have a very wide and very diverse set of lenses that they look through to see the past, they are the most conservative tribe in the world when it comes to their methodology for presenting knowledge to the public. And so I so appreciate the work that the three of you and all of your collaborators in Ask Historians are doing, because I think it's telling that there are 2 million members in the, give or take, in the Ask Historians subreddit. And there are literally dozens of people who are interested in what happens at the American Historical Association every year. Okay, that's an exaggeration. There are literally hundreds of people who are interested in what happens at the American Historical Association annual meeting every year. And so, you know, I think it's obvious that the work that Ask Historians and other similar kinds of efforts are doing is showing a way forward into the next generation of knowledge creation. And I don't have a lot of hope for the generation of historians that I'm part of, and I didn't give my visual explanation. I am a male presenting white person with a lot of gray hair. I'm just about to turn 65, and so I've watched all of these changes happen over the last 30 years as the World Wide Web, as we used to call it back in the day, first appeared in our sort of range of vision. And so it's very exciting that the work that you all are doing. I appreciate the critical lens that you've brought to the various questions that you raised today. And I hope that this kind of work will just continue. So thank you all very much.